The last time human beings stood on the surface of the moon, Richard Nixon was president, the Vietnam War was still being fought, and the most powerful computer on Earth had less processing power than a modern greeting card. That was 1972. More than half a century has passed since that moment, and in all the decades that followed, not a single human being has gone back. Not because we forgot how, not because we lost interest, but because the path back to the moon turns out to be far more complicated, far more expensive, and far more politically entangled than anyone wanted to admit. Now, finally, that is changing. And the way it is changing tells us something remarkable about the era we are living in. An era where the race to the moon is no longer between nations, but between corporations. Where the stakes are not just scientific prestige, but something that looks increasingly like territorial dominance of an entirely new world. This is the story of Artemis 3, not just the mission itself, but everything that has to happen before a single astronaut takes a single step on lunar soil. It is a story of engineering ambition that borders on the reckless, of competition between two of the most powerful private space companies ever created, and of a geopolitical urgency that echoes the original space race of the 1960s in ways that few people have fully reckoned with. To understand where we are going, it helps to understand how we got here. When NASA retired the space shuttle in 2011, it left the United States without any domestic capability to launch astronauts to space. For nearly a decade, American astronauts rode Russian Soyuz capsules to reach the International Space Station, paying roughly $80 million per seat for the privilege. It was a situation that embarrassed many inside the agency and created real strategic vulnerabilities that policymakers could not ignore. The solution, initially, was the Space Launch System, a massive government-built rocket designed to carry the Orion crew capsule on deep space missions. Development began formally in 2011 and immediately ran into the challenges that plague almost every large government program: cost overruns, schedule delays, and the weight of institutional caution that comes from designing a system where failure is politically catastrophic. The Space Launch System is not a subtle vehicle. When it stands fully assembled on its mobile launcher at Kennedy Space Center, it reaches nearly 100 meters into the Florida sky. Its 4 RS-25 engines, the same engines that once powered the space shuttle, burn through liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen at a combined rate that is almost incomprehensible. At liftoff, the solid rocket boosters flanking the core stage contribute an additional thrust that brings the total to over 8.8 million pounds of force. For comparison, the Saturn V rocket that sent Apollo astronauts to the moon produced about 7.6 million pounds of thrust. The Space Launch System is, by any measure, one of the most powerful rockets ever built. Artemis 1, the first uncrewed test flight of this system, launched in November 2022 after years of delays. It was a defining moment for the program and for NASA's credibility. The Orion capsule traveled to the moon, entered a distant retrograde orbit, and came back to Earth after a mission lasting 25.5 days. The heat shield performed, the parachutes deployed, the capsule splashed down in the Pacific. It was, by most technical measures, a success. Artemis 2 built on that foundation. It carried 4 astronauts: Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Canadian Space Agency astronaut Jeremy Hansen, on a trajectory around the moon. It was the first time human beings had traveled to the vicinity of the moon since the final Apollo mission. They did not land. They looped around, tested systems, and came home. But the psychological and symbolic weight of that flight was significant. Real people had gone back to the deep space environment, had looked back at Earth from 250,000 miles away, and had returned safely. With the success of Artemis 2 behind it, NASA has pivoted hard toward the next phase, and this is where the story gets genuinely complicated. Because Artemis 3, the mission that will actually put human beings back on the lunar surface, requires something that no American rocket program has ever needed in quite this way before. It requires a privately developed lunar lander, not a lander designed and built by NASA, not a government program with government engineers following government specifications. A lander designed, built, and operated by a commercial company, flying its own rocket to the moon under a fixed-price contract. This decision was not made lightly. It reflects a fundamental shift in how NASA approaches exploration, a shift that has been building for more than a decade, accelerated by budget constraints, and now locked in as official policy. The agency has concluded that it cannot afford to design and build every component of a lunar architecture in-house. Instead, it will buy services from commercial providers, the same way it buys seats on commercial airlines, and focus its own engineering resources on the elements only the government can provide. The result is one of the most consequential and openly competitive procurement processes in the history of American aerospace. In April 2021, NASA awarded a single contract for the Human Landing System, the vehicle that would carry astronauts from lunar orbit to the surface and back to SpaceX. The contract was worth $2.9 billion, a figure that sounds enormous until you consider what it is actually asking for. SpaceX was being paid to take Starship, a rocket that at the time existed largely as a prototype, barely capable of landing itself after a short hop, and transform it into a crude lunar lander capable of descending to the surface of another world and returning to orbit. The decision to award the contract to SpaceX alone, rather than splitting it between multiple companies, as NASA had originally planned, generated immediate controversy. Blue Origin, the company founded by Jeff Bezos, filed a formal protest with the Government Accountability Office, arguing that the process had been flawed. The protest was ultimately unsuccessful, but it revealed the depth of feeling in the industry about the stakes involved. Then, in May 2023, NASA made a second decision that changed the shape of everything that would follow. Watching the pace of Starship development, which was moving fast by any absolute measure, but had already slipped well behind the timelines. Elon Musk had publicly promised the agency awarded a second Human Landing System contract, this time to Blue Origin. The contract was worth $3.4 billion and covered a vehicle called Blue Moon. Now there were two companies racing to build the first commercial lunar lander, and both of them were flying rockets that, at the time of the award, had never successfully completed an orbital mission. It is worth pausing here to understand what Starship actually is, because it is easy to look at the development timeline and miss how genuinely unprecedented this vehicle is. Starship is not a rocket in the traditional sense, or rather, it is a rocket, but it is also something more complete, rapidly reusable transportation system designed to carry massive payloads and large numbers of people anywhere in the solar system. The vehicle consists of two parts, a first stage booster called Super Heavy and an upper stage called Starship, which can serve as both a spacecraft and, in the lunar configuration, a lander. The numbers involved are staggering. Starship stands approximately 120 meters tall, when fully stacked, taller than the Space Launch System, taller than the Saturn V, taller than any rocket ever flown before. The Super Heavy booster is powered by 33 Raptor engines burning methane and liquid oxygen, generating a combined thrust at liftoff of approximately 74 meganewtons. That is more than double the thrust of the Saturn V. But the most radical thing about Starship is not its size or its power. It is the approach to reusability. SpaceX has designed this system so that both the booster and the upper stage can be caught and reflown the booster by mechanical arms mounted on the launch tower, a system that the company calls Mechazilla, and the upper stage by landing on either legs or catching hardware depending on the version. The vision is a rocket that can be launched, refueled, and relaunched within hours, the same way a commercial aircraft turns around between flights. This vision, if fully realized, would reduce the cost of access to space by orders of magnitude. It would make deep space exploration economically accessible in ways that have never been true before. It would, in the language of the industry, change everything. Whether that vision can be realized on the timeline that NASA requires for Artemis 3 is a different question entirely. The development of Starship has proceeded through a series of increasingly ambitious test flights, each one pushing the system further than the one before. The earliest tests involved relatively small prototypes, vehicles designated Starhopper, and early numbered iterations of Starship that conducted short vertical takeoff and landing tests. These flights were valuable for gathering data on the Raptor engine and the aerodynamic control surfaces, but they were far from demonstrating a system capable of reaching orbit. By late 2021, SpaceX had moved to much larger and more capable prototypes. The full Starship Super Heavy stack made its first orbital attempt in April 2023, a launch that generated enormous attention and ended when the vehicle lost control and was intentionally destroyed over the Gulf of Mexico about 4 minutes after liftoff. The launch tower itself sustained significant damage from the acoustic and mechanical forces of 33 Raptor engines firing simultaneously. The second orbital attempt, in November 2023, went further. The vehicle reached a higher altitude before both stages were lost. Starship exploded during re-entry, and the booster was destroyed after failing to achieve the planned return burn. But the fact that stage separation occurred cleanly, that the upper stage ignited its engines in space, and that the flight lasted longer than the first, was treated as real progress. The third and fourth flights, in March and June 2024 respectively, marked genuinely significant milestones. On the fourth flight, both the Super Heavy booster and the Starship upper stage survived to complete controlled splashdowns, the booster in the Gulf of Mexico, the upper stage in the Indian Ocean. For the first time, SpaceX had demonstrated that the full system could complete a suborbital flight and return both stages in a controlled manner. Subsequent flights pushed further. The booster was caught by the mechanical arms of the launch tower, something that had never been attempted before on any rocket of this size, and that many aerospace engineers had considered either impossible or insanely risky. The fact that it worked on the first attempt said something remarkable about the precision of SpaceX's engineering and guidance systems. Through all of this, the version of Starship being tested was what the company calls a prototype, a vehicle built to gather data, not to perform operational missions. The systems needed to make Starship a real human spacecraft. The life support systems, the crew cabin, the hatches and airlocks, the radiation shielding, the communication systems had not yet been integrated. For the Lunar version specifically, the docking port, the landing legs optimized for the lunar surface, and the fuel capacity for a fully loaded descent all required additional development work. None of this was a surprise to engineers who understood the complexity of the problem. But it did mean that the timeline for a lunar-capable Starship was compressing rapidly. Meanwhile, across the country, in Kent, Washington, Blue Origin had been quietly making its own progress on a trajectory that would turn it from a space tourism operation into a serious competitor for orbital and deep space missions. Blue Origin was founded by Jeff Bezos in the year 2000, making it actually older than SpaceX, which Elon Musk founded in 2002. For most of its history, however, Blue Origin operated with a very different philosophy and a very different pace. Where SpaceX moved aggressively, launching frequently and accepting failures as data, Blue Origin moved methodically, keeping most of its work out of the public eye and flying infrequently. The company's public reputation was built primarily on its new Shepard vehicle, a small suborbital rocket designed to carry passengers briefly above the Kármán line, the internationally recognized boundary of space at 100 kilometers altitude. New Shepard flew more than 24 successful missions, including the famous flight in July 2021 that carried Jeff Bezos, his brother Mark, aviation pioneer Wally Funk, and Dutch student Oliver Damon on a brief 10-minute journey to the edge of space and back. But New Shepard was never a vehicle capable of reaching orbit, and the company had long been working on something far more ambitious, New Glenn, a large orbital rocket capable of competing directly with SpaceX's Falcon 9 and eventually supporting deep space missions. New Glenn is a significant vehicle. Standing 98 meters tall, it uses liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen in its upper stage, a propellant combination chosen for its high specific impulse, meaning it extracts more thrust per kilogram of propellant than rocket fuels based on kerosene or methane. The first stage is powered by 7 BE-4 engines, burning liquefied natural gas and liquid oxygen, generating approximately 17 meganewtons of thrust at liftoff. The first launch of New Glenn occurred in January 2025. It was a mission that the entire aerospace industry watched closely, partly because of its importance to Blue Origin's business, and partly because of its implications for the competition to build the lunar lander. The flight went mostly as planned. The upper stage reached orbit and successfully demonstrated the vehicle's basic performance. The first stage, attempting to land on a ship positioned downrange in the Atlantic Ocean, was lost when it failed to complete the return maneuver, but the core mission was accomplished. Then, in November 2025, New Glenn flew again. This second flight was the one that transformed perceptions of Blue Origin as a serious player. Both stages performed as intended. The upper stage deployed 2 satellites on a trajectory toward Mars, a demonstration of the vehicle's genuine deep space capability. And the first stage completed a soft, controlled landing on the platform at sea, demonstrating the reusability that Blue Origin had long promised and now delivered. In a single flight, Blue Origin had done something it had been trying to do for years: prove that it belonged in the same conversation as SpaceX. The New Glenn had caught up, more or less, to where Falcon 9 was several years into its operational career. The gap was still real. SpaceX had far more flights and far more operational experience, but it was no longer a gap between a serious space company and an aspirational one. It was a gap that, with continued investment and continued flights, could plausibly close. This is the context in which NASA made the decision that defines the current shape of the Artemis 3 plan. With 2 companies developing lunar landers on overlapping timelines, and with the moon landing itself still years away, the agency concluded that the original plan for Artemis 3 was too risky. That original plan called for astronauts to travel to lunar orbit on the Orion capsule, rendezvous with a lander that had never been tested by humans, enter it for the first time while already in the vicinity of another world, and descend to the surface. If anything went wrong, if a system that had never been operated in microgravity by actual crew members failed to perform, the consequences could be fatal, and there would be no quick rescue available. The new plan is more cautious, more layered, and considerably more complex to execute, but it is also, arguably, more honest about the genuine difficulty of what is being attempted. Under the revised plan, Artemis 3 will not attempt a moon landing at all. Instead, it will conduct what amounts to the most ambitious systems integration test in the history of human spaceflight, doing it in low Earth orbit, where the crew can abort and come home within hours if something goes wrong. Here is what that actually looks like. The mission will begin not with one rocket launch, but with multiple launches occurring over a compressed time frame. The first launches will be the lunar landers themselves, Starship in its lunar configuration, and potentially Blue Moon as well, depending on which companies are ready. These vehicles will be placed in low Earth orbit, where they will wait for the next phase of the mission. But placing a lunar lander in orbit is not the end of the preparation. It is, in some ways, the beginning of the hardest part, because both Starship and Blue Moon are massive vehicles. They are designed to carry people to the surface of the moon and back, which requires an enormous amount of propellant, far more than can be practically loaded before launch, while keeping the vehicle within the payload limits of existing rockets. The solution, which both companies have been planning for years, is orbital refueling. Launching the lander with partial propellant, launching a separate tanker vehicle carrying additional propellant, and transferring that propellant in orbit before proceeding to the moon. This has never been done before. Let that settle for a moment. In all of human spaceflight history, stretching back to Sputnik in 1957 and encompassing everything from Apollo to the International Space Station, no mission has ever involved the transfer of cryogenic propellant between two vehicles in orbit. The engineering challenges are significant. Cryogenic propellants, liquid hydrogen, liquid oxygen, liquid methane must be kept at extremely low temperatures. They tend to boil off and expand into gas when not actively managed. The microgravity environment of orbit creates fluid dynamics that have no equivalent on Earth, where gravity keeps liquids at the bottom of tanks. And the processes of connecting, sealing, transferring, and disconnecting propellant lines between two spacecraft require hardware and procedures that have been studied extensively but never actually demonstrated in space. For SpaceX, orbital refueling requires launching a second Starship vehicle configured as a tanker, flying it to the same orbit as the Lunar Starship, conducting a rendezvous and docking, and transferring hundreds of tons of liquid methane and liquid oxygen from one vehicle to the other. The company has been developing the technology for this process for years and has conducted some preliminary tests on earlier flights. For Blue Origin, the process is different in detail but similar in concept. A separate vehicle, a propellant transport, will carry the additional cryogenic fuel needed to top off the Blue Moon lander before it departs for the Moon. The Blue Moon architecture uses liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, which present their own set of handling challenges, as liquid hydrogen is the coldest and least dense of all commonly used rocket propellants. So, before the Orion capsule even leaves the ground with its crew of 4 astronauts, there will be multiple large rockets already in orbit, having conducted the first ever demonstration of cryogenic propellant transfer in space. Only after that is complete will the Space Launch System light its engines. The launch of SLS for Artemis 3 will be visually identical to what happened on Artemis 2. The same enormous orange rocket, the same mobile launcher, the same flood of light and sound and vibration rolling across Merritt Island and washing over the watching crowd. The crew of 4 astronauts will strap into their Orion capsule and ride a column of fire and steam into the sky. But this time, once they reach orbit, they will not be heading for the Moon. They will be heading for the lunar landers. Rendezvous and docking is a skill that human spaceflight has been developing since the Gemini program in the 1960s. The basic concept, bringing 2 spacecraft together in orbit, matching their velocities precisely enough to allow physical connection, sounds straightforward. In practice, it requires continuous adjustment of the spacecraft's trajectory using small thruster firings, careful monitoring of the closing distance and rate, and a level of precision that has no real equivalent in any other form of transportation. 2 objects, each moving at roughly 7.5 kilometers per second relative to the Earth, must come together close enough to mate physically while moving at essentially identical velocities relative to each other. The astronauts of Artemis 2 actually practiced a version of this. During that mission, pilot Victor Glover flew Orion toward the spent upper stage of the SLS rocket, a large inert object that served as a proxy for the kind of docking target the crew would face on future missions. The exercise was valuable not just as a skills demonstration, but as a data collection effort, giving engineers real information about how Orion handles during proximity operations. On Artemis 3, the docking will be with a real lander, and it will need to be done precisely enough for the crew to transfer safely. The architecture of the two landers creates different experiences for the crew during the docking and transfer phase. The Blue Moon lander is designed with its docking port on the side of the crew cabin, located at the bottom of the vehicle. Above the crew cabin, stacked vertically, are large propellant tanks, the hydrogen and oxygen that will power the descent and ascent engines. The crew cabin itself is pressurized and habitable, with dimensions that, while not spacious by any absolute measure, represent a significant improvement over the Apollo lunar module. When you look at a size comparison between Blue Moon's crew area and the original lunar module, the difference is meaningful. More room to move, more room to store equipment, and more room for the kinds of contingencies that arise in any complex operation. Approaching and docking with Blue Moon will require Orion to fly alongside the lander, match its trajectory and orientation, and align its docking port with the connection point on the crew cabin. Once docked, the crew will move through the connecting tunnel and into the lander's pressurized interior. The Starship experience is fundamentally different. Starship's docking port is located at the nose of the vehicle at the very top of a structure nearly 50 meters tall. Orion approaches from above, noses pointing toward each other, and docks at the tip. Once connected, the crew descends from the Orion capsule into the nose of Starship and then continues moving downward through the vehicle toward the flight deck, which is positioned several stories below. The interior they encounter is, by any standard, remarkable. A 9-meter diameter pressurized cylinder that dwarfs every crew compartment ever flown in human spaceflight history. The Apollo command module had an interior volume of roughly 6 cubic meters. The Starship flight deck is orders of magnitude larger. Once inside one or both landers, the crew of Artemis 3 will begin a systematic, methodical assessment of every critical system the vehicle possesses. Life support is the first priority. Everything that keeps human beings alive in the vacuum of space, the oxygen generation systems, the carbon dioxide scrubbers, the temperature regulation hardware, the water recovery systems must be verified to work correctly in actual microgravity conditions. Hardware that functions perfectly in testing on Earth sometimes behaves differently when gravity is no longer present. Fluids move in unexpected ways. Mechanical systems that rely on gravity for alignment may need adjustment. The first time any of this equipment encounters actual spaceflight conditions with a human crew dependent on it, the crew needs to be somewhere they can escape from quickly if something fails. Propulsion systems are next. The engines that will eventually carry astronauts down to the moon and back up again will be tested at low thrust levels, verifying performance and confirming that the guidance systems respond correctly to crew inputs and software commands. Communications are checked across multiple frequency bands and configurations, because the moon is a place where communication can be interrupted and where the procedures for maintaining contact are different from low Earth orbit. Power systems, the solar panels, batteries, fuel cells, and power distribution networks that provide electricity for every other system are verified through multiple operating modes. And then, perhaps the most significant test of the entire Artemis 3 mission, the astronauts will try on their lunar spacesuits for the first time in actual microgravity. These suits are not the white pressurized garments of the Apollo era, or the orange launch and entry suits of the shuttle program, or even the extravehicular suits currently worn on the International Space Station. They are a new design, developed by Axiom Space under a contract with NASA, and they represent the current state-of-the-art in human pressure suit engineering. The AXIMU, the Axiom Extravehicular Mobility Unit, is designed to allow a far greater range of motion than any of its predecessors. The Apollo suits were notoriously stiff and restrictive. Astronauts working on the lunar surface during the Apollo missions reported significant physical fatigue from simply working against the resistance of their pressurized garments. They could not fully extend their arms, could not kneel easily, and had to develop specialized body positions to handle tools and collect samples. Watching footage of Apollo moonwalkers, the physical awkwardness is evident even through the bulk of the suits. The XMU addresses these limitations through new approaches to joint design, new materials for the suit's outer shell, and a helmet system that provides a wider field of view than was available to Apollo astronauts. The suit is designed to allow the wearer to kneel, to reach overhead, and to move with something approaching the fluidity of normal human motion in Earth's gravity. But all of this has been tested underwater in NASA's Neutral Buoyancy Laboratory at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, where a giant pool simulates the reduced gravity environment of space. Underwater testing is valuable, but it is not the same as actual vacuum. The suit has never been exposed to the complete absence of atmospheric pressure in actual space. On Artemis 3, the crew will carry those suits into an airlock aboard the lander and depressurize it. The suits will inflate fully for the first time in real space. The joints will be loaded against actual vacuum. The thermal coatings will be exposed to the real temperature extremes of orbit, scorching heat in sunlight, intense cold in shadow. And if anything does not work as expected, the crew will have a pressurized vehicle and an Orion capsule to retreat to. NASA estimates that the full complement of tests, evaluations, suit checks, system exercises, and contingency procedures will take the crew approximately 3 weeks to complete. 3 weeks in low Earth orbit, aboard vehicles that have never been occupied by humans, running through the checklist that must be completed before anyone trusts their lives to these machines at 250,000 miles from home. This is the mission that will be called Artemis 3. It is worth comparing this to what the original Artemis 3 plan looked like, because the contrast is instructive about how NASA's thinking has evolved. Under the original architecture, Artemis 3 was supposed to land people on the moon. The crew would travel to lunar orbit on Orion, rendezvous with a human landing system that was waiting there, enter it for the first time, check out its systems while already orbiting the moon, and then descend to the surface. There were serious people inside and outside NASA who thought this was too compressed, too aggressive, too accepting of risk. The lunar orbit rendezvous approach that made the Apollo program work was developed over years, with Mercury, Gemini, and early Apollo missions methodically building the capabilities needed at each step. What was being proposed for Artemis 3 squeezed far more uncertainty into a single mission. The revised approach fixes this. By testing the landers in Earth orbit, first where an abort means coming home in hours rather than days, the program gives itself the opportunity to discover problems before they become fatal, in a place where help cannot reach you. There is also a competitive logic to the new timeline that shapes what comes next. Because NASA has 2 lander contractors, and because the agency has structured the program to select one vehicle for the actual lunar landing based on demonstrated performance, the period between now and Artemis 3 is intensely competitive. In May 2026, SpaceX plans to conduct the first flight of Starship version 3, what the company describes as the first non-prototype version of the vehicle. Everything that has flown before has been, in the company's framing, a development vehicle, a platform for learning, for testing, for gathering data that feeds back into the design. Version 3 is the design that incorporates everything learned from those earlier flights. It will launch from a newly completed launch pad at Starbase in Boca Chica, Texas, which has been designed with better acoustic suppression, better mechanical infrastructure, and better turnaround capability than the original launch site. If Starship version 3 performs as planned, it will still need to be outfitted with the hardware specific to the lunar mission, the crew habitation systems, the life support equipment, the exterior lighting, the landing leg package optimized for the lunar South Pole, and the docking hardware that will interface with Orion. There is approximately a year between the planned initial version 3 flight and the date when a crew-capable lunar starship would need to be ready for Artemis 3. That is an aggressive timeline, but it is a manageable one if the basic vehicle performs. Over at Blue Origin's facility in Kent, Washington, the same month of May 2026 carries a different kind of historic significance. The company plans to conduct a test flight of the Blue Moon Mark 1, a smaller version of the full Blue Moon human landing system, designed to deliver medium-sized cargo payloads to the lunar surface. This vehicle will not carry people, but it will, if the mission succeeds, demonstrate something that neither SpaceX nor any American company has done since 1972, a controlled landing on the surface of the moon. The significance of that demonstration is hard to overstate. Landing on the moon is genuinely difficult. The moon has no atmosphere, so the techniques used to slow spacecraft on Mars, using atmospheric drag, to bleed off speed before deploying parachutes do not work. Everything must be done with rocket thrust. The vehicle must conduct a powered descent that takes it from orbital velocity, roughly 1.6 kilometers per second relative to the lunar surface, all the way down to zero, while also maneuvering horizontally to reach the exact landing site. The descent must be conducted autonomously, because the communication delay between Earth and the Moon, about 1.25 seconds each way, means that human controllers cannot respond in real time to unexpected situations during the final approach. The navigation must be precise enough to land within a target area that may be defined by the surrounding terrain, because the lunar South Pole, where Artemis missions are targeting, is a region of complex topography with permanently shadowed craters, ridges, and slopes that can make some landing sites dangerous and others impossible. The touchdown sensors must recognize the moment of contact and shut down the engines before the vehicle bounces or tips. And all of this must work the first time because there is no going back for a second pass. If Blue Moon Mark 1 pulls off an autonomous cargo landing on the moon in May 2026, it changes the entire character of the competition with SpaceX. It transforms Blue Origin from a company that has demonstrated capable Earth orbit hardware into a company that has actually landed something on the moon. The confidence that would generate within NASA, within Congress, and within the public would be substantial. If it fails, Blue Origin will learn from the failure and try again, as SpaceX has done with Starship. But the timing is tight. Assuming that Artemis 3 goes well, that the landers are successfully tested in Earth orbit, that the orbital refueling demonstrations succeed, that the suit tests reveal no critical problems requiring redesign, the program will move immediately to the next phase. That next phase is an autonomous, uncrewed lunar landing. Call it Artemis 3.5 if you want a convenient label, though NASA does not use that designation officially. The concept is straightforward. Whichever lander has performed best during the Earth orbit tests will be sent to the moon on its own, without a crew, to demonstrate that it can actually land on the surface and take off again. Only when that has been demonstrated, when the full descent and ascent sequence has been completed successfully, will the program declare one vehicle the winner and schedule a crewed landing. This is the mission that will be called Artemis 4, and NASA wants it to happen within 1 year of Artemis 3. That timeline is ferociously demanding. A 1-year gap between Artemis 3 and Artemis 4 would be, by historical standards, extraordinarily compressed. The Apollo program took years to build, from an Earth orbit test to a lunar landing. The Artemis program, operating with vehicles that are already partially developed and with institutional knowledge accumulated over decades of spaceflight, is attempting to compress that process dramatically. Part of what makes this possible, if it is possible, is the commercial model. SpaceX and Blue Origin are not government contractors building hardware on a cost-plus basis, where the government absorbs cost overruns, and the contractor has limited incentive to control schedule. They are commercial companies competing for future contracts. Every month of delay is a month of cost they absorb. Every failure is a setback that damages their competitive position. The incentive structure is different, and it produces different behavior. Whether it produces fast enough behavior to meet NASA's timeline is what the next several years will determine. But the urgency driving that timeline is not coming solely from the ambitions of engineers or the aspirations of astronauts. It is coming from something much larger and much more geopolitical in nature. China is going to the moon. This is not speculation. It is not a distant ambition. It is a declared national goal, backed by a functioning space program that has demonstrated real capability at every scale, from Earth orbit to robotic lunar missions to deep space exploration. China's Chang'e program has already accomplished what no other nation managed to do in the decades following Apollo. It landed spacecraft on the lunar surface and, critically, it landed on the far side, the side that never faces Earth, a challenge that requires relay satellites in distant orbits to maintain communication. The Chang'e 5 mission in 2020 brought lunar samples back to Earth for the first time since the Soviet lunar program ended in the 1970s. China's stated plan is to land taikonauts on the moon before 2035, and some estimates suggest the timeline could be pushed earlier. The China National Space Administration and the Chinese People's Liberation Army Strategic Support Force are working together on this goal with the kind of sustained institutional investment that has characterized China's space program for more than 20 years. And China is not working alone. Russia has signed cooperation agreements with China on lunar exploration. Together, the two countries are working toward a vision of a permanently crewed research station at the lunar South Pole, the same region where NASA is targeting its Artemis landings. The lunar South Pole is not an arbitrary destination. It is the most strategically valuable real estate on the moon, for reasons that have to do with ice. Permanently shadowed craters near the lunar poles contain water ice that has been accumulating for billions of years, deposited by comet impacts, solar wind interactions, and other processes, and preserved by the perpetual darkness that keeps temperatures in those craters near -240 degrees Celsius. This ice is not just scientifically interesting, it is a resource. Water can be split into hydrogen and oxygen using electrical power from solar panels. Hydrogen and oxygen are rocket propellants. A lunar facility near a large ice deposit could, in principle, manufacture rocket fuel on site, turning the moon into a refueling station for missions going deeper into the solar system. The country or alliance that establishes a permanent presence near that ice and develops the ability to extract and process it at scale will have a significant strategic advantage in any future contest for dominance beyond Earth orbit. This is why the race to the moon is not, in the end, just about planting a flag or conducting scientific experiments. It is about establishing presence, demonstrating capability, and claiming the high ground, literally, in what many analysts believe will be the defining strategic domain of the 21st century. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967 prohibits nations from claiming sovereignty over the moon or any other celestial body. But the treaty was written in an era when lunar operations were purely governmental and largely symbolic. It says nothing clear about commercial extraction of resources. It says nothing about the right to occupy and operate in a specific location. And it was negotiated before anyone could seriously contemplate the possibility of a permanent human settlement on another world. These legal ambiguities are not theoretical concerns. They are active policy questions being debated by governments and international bodies right now. The Artemis Accords, a set of bilateral agreements that the United States has been building with partner nations since 2020, represent one attempt to establish norms of behavior for lunar exploration. But China and Russia have declined to sign, and the question of who gets to do what near the lunar South Pole has no clear resolution. Into this geopolitical context, the Artemis program carries weight that goes far beyond the intrinsic scientific value of returning to the moon. The astronauts who will stand on the lunar surface for the first time in more than 50 years will be the visible face of something that is ultimately about national capability, economic competitiveness, and the strategic positioning of civilizations at the edge of a future that is genuinely difficult to predict with confidence. What we can say with confidence is this: the technology being developed for Artemis is fundamentally different from anything that existed during Apollo in ways that matter enormously for the long-term future of human expansion into space. The Saturn V was an extraordinary machine, but it was not reusable. Every Apollo mission consumed hardware worth hundreds of millions of dollars that fell into the ocean or burned up on re-entry. The Starship architecture, if it works as designed, changes that equation completely. A fully reusable system that can be reflown dozens of times before major refurbishment, and that can be refueled in orbit to reach destinations anywhere in the inner solar system, is not just a better rocket. It is a different kind of infrastructure. Blue Moon's architecture, using liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, and designed for eventual integration with lunar ice extraction, similarly points towards something beyond simple exploration. It points toward a supply chain, a system for moving propellant and cargo between Earth, the Moon, and eventually deeper into space, that could sustain a permanent human presence beyond Earth in a way that has never previously been economically viable. None of this is guaranteed. All of it depends on whether the hardware works, whether the companies can meet their schedules, whether the funding continues to flow, and whether the political will in the United States and other participating nations holds together over the years and decades that will be required to build this future. What Artemis 3 represents, in this context, is a critical inflection point. It is the mission that will determine whether the technology actually works as advertised, before anyone's life depends on it, at a location where the consequences of failure are irreversible. 3 weeks in Earth orbit, 2 commercial lunar landers, the first orbital propellant transfer in human history, the first flight of spacesuits designed for the next generation of moon exploration. And at the end of it, a verdict on which vehicle, or perhaps both vehicles, in some configuration, will carry human beings back to the surface of another world. The questions that Artemis 3 cannot answer are themselves fascinating. We do not yet know how well orbital refueling will actually work at the scale required for a lunar mission. The demonstrations will give us data, but the actual transfer will be many times larger than anything previously attempted. We do not know how the Axiom suits will perform across the full range of conditions encountered on the lunar surface, the extreme temperature swings, the abrasive regolith, the radiation environment that has no equivalent in Earth orbit. We do not know which lander will ultimately prove more reliable, more maintainable, and more capable of the regular operations that sustained lunar exploration will require. And we do not know with any certainty how the competition with China will play out. The timeline for a Chinese crewed lunar landing is uncertain. The capabilities of the Chinese landing system are not fully public. The question of whether China and the United States will find themselves competing for the same landing sites, negotiating some form of mutual accommodation, or developing parallel but largely separate presences in different parts of the lunar South Pole is genuinely open. What we do know is that the pace of events is accelerating. The flights are happening, the contracts have been awarded, the hardware is being built, the rockets are being tested, and within a few years, for the first time in the lifetimes of most people alive today, there will again be human beings standing somewhere that is not the Earth. That is not a small thing. That is not a routine accomplishment of government bureaucracy or industrial process. Whatever the political and strategic motivations that are driving it, whatever the commercial incentives that are shaping its architecture, whatever the ambiguities and delays and technical challenges that lie ahead, the fact that human beings are genuinely, credibly, measurably on the path back to the lunar surface is one of the most significant developments of our time. The work being done right now in factories in Washington State and Texas, in mission control rooms in Houston, in the offices of the NASA administrator, in the design labs where engineers are figuring out how to transfer liquid methane between two spacecraft, moving at 27,000 kilometers per hour. All of that work is building towards something that the species will still be talking about in another 50 years. Artemis 3 is not the destination. It is the verification that the path to the destination is real, and that, in the long arc of human exploration, is exactly where we need to be right now. If this kind of deep coverage of space exploration matters to you, the engineering, the geopolitics, for the genuine uncertainty of what comes next, the best thing you can do is stay engaged with sources that take it seriously and share what you learn with people who might not be following it yet. The story is moving fast, and it deserves more attention than it usually gets. To understand the genuine scope of what the Artemis program is attempting, it helps to spend some time with the history of failed attempts to return to the moon that preceded it, because that history is longer and more instructive than most people realize. The years immediately following Apollo did not see a natural progression toward further lunar exploration. They saw something closer to the opposite. The end of the Apollo program was not forced by a technological failure or a catastrophic accident. It was a policy decision driven primarily by cost and political priorities. Each Apollo mission cost, in today's equivalent dollars, somewhere between $1 and $2 billion. The total program cost, from inception through the final mission, runs to hundreds of billions in modern terms. In the early 1970s, with Vietnam consuming enormous resources, with domestic social programs competing for federal attention, and with a public that had watched a dozen men walk on the moon and had begun to treat the achievement as almost routine, there was no political constituency for continuing. The Apollo program ended with Apollo 17 in December 1972. Apollo missions 18, 19, and 20 had been planned and were cancelled. The hardware that had been built for them was repurposed or put in museums. What followed was a long period in which the United States remained a spacefaring nation of tremendous capability, but directed that capability almost entirely toward Earth orbit. The Space Shuttle, which flew from 1981 to 2011, was a magnificent achievement, in many ways the first truly reusable spacecraft, capable of carrying large crews and massive payloads, and responsible for constructing and servicing the International Space Station. But it was designed for low Earth orbit, and it flew in low Earth orbit. The deep space capability that Apollo had demonstrated was allowed to atrophy. There were proposals over the years for returning to the moon. The Space Exploration Initiative, proposed by President George H.W. Bush in 1989, called for a space station, a return to the moon, and eventually a crewed mission to Mars. It was costed at approximately $500 billion over 30 years and was quickly shelved. The vision for space exploration, announced by President George W. Bush in 2004, following the loss of Space Shuttle Columbia, established goals that included a crewed return to the moon by 2020 and eventually a mission to Mars. This initiative led directly to the development of the Space Launch System and the Orion capsule, though it was later refocused and restructured by subsequent administrations. The Constellation program, developed under this initiative, was cancelled by President Obama in 2010 amid criticisms that it was over budget and behind schedule. What Artemis represents is, in part, a third major attempt to get this done, and the differences from previous attempts are real and meaningful. One of the most significant differences is the involvement of commercial companies in genuinely substantive roles, not as contractors building hardware to government specifications, but as partners designing and operating their own vehicles and competing against each other for continued business. This model traces its origins to the Commercial Crew Program, through which NASA contracted with SpaceX and Boeing to develop crewed vehicles for transporting astronauts to the International Space Station. SpaceX's Dragon capsule, flying on the Falcon 9 rocket, has performed this function successfully since 2020, carrying dozens of astronauts to and from the station. Boeing's Starliner had a much more troubled development, with multiple delays and technical issues, but eventually flew its first crewed mission. The model worked, not perfectly, but well enough to demonstrate that commercial development of human-rated spacecraft was viable. The Human Landing System program extends this model to a far more difficult challenge. Launching people to the space station, roughly 400 kilometers above the Earth's surface, is a well-understood problem. Dozens of rockets have done it. The physics are known, the conditions are predictable, and the station itself provides a stable destination with experienced crews and robust life support. Landing on the Moon is categorically different. The destination has never had a permanent human presence. The environment is harsher. The communication latency makes real-time human control of the landing impossible. And the vehicle must not only land safely, but also ascend from the surface, reach lunar orbit, and dock with a waiting Orion capsule, all while functioning reliably after exposure to the temperatures, radiation, and regolith of the lunar surface. This is asking an enormous amount of commercial companies that are, in the final analysis, still early in their deep space development. SpaceX has flown hundreds of missions in Earth orbit and has now landed boosters routinely. But lunar operations are a genuinely different regime. Blue Origin has demonstrated an operational orbital rocket and is working toward its lunar hardware. But neither company has yet demonstrated the complete chain of capabilities needed for a crewed lunar mission. The Artemis 3 Earth orbit test is designed to close those gaps, or more precisely, to identify where the remaining gaps are, so they can be closed before the mission where failure would be catastrophic. The role that orbital dynamics plays in all of this deserves a more careful examination, because it shapes the entire sequence of events in ways that are not immediately obvious. When people think about going to the Moon, they often visualize a straightforward journey: launch from Earth, travel through space, arrive at the Moon. The reality is considerably more complex. Objects in space move continuously, following curved paths determined by the gravitational fields of nearby bodies. A spacecraft in orbit is not stationary. It is moving at thousands of kilometers per hour, constantly falling toward the Earth, or the Moon, or whatever body it is orbiting, while also moving sideways fast enough that its path curves away from the surface at the same rate as it falls. This balance between falling and moving sideways is what orbit is mathematically. To get from Earth orbit to lunar orbit, a spacecraft must execute what is called a translunar injection, a precisely timed engine burn that increases its velocity enough to escape low Earth orbit and follow a long curved path that intersects the Moon's location. Several days later, the Orion capsule does this with its European service module, which carries the propellant needed for this maneuver and for the subsequent engine burns needed to enter lunar orbit and then later depart and return to Earth. The lunar landers in the Artemis architecture take a different path. They launch to low Earth orbit, refuel there, and then execute their own translunar injection to travel to the Moon potentially several days before Orion launches, so that everything can be in position and properly checked out before the crew arrives. The timing of all of this is constrained by what are called launch windows, specific periods when the relative positions of Earth and Moon make a particular trajectory possible or optimal. Miss the window, and you either wait for the next one or accept a less efficient trajectory that requires more propellant. For Artemis 3, coordinating the launch windows for potentially 4 or 5 separate rockets, each with its own constraints and contingencies, is an exercise in mission planning complexity that goes well beyond anything attempted in the Apollo era. The crew that will fly Artemis 3 has not yet been officially announced at the time of this writing, though candidate astronauts from the Artemis pool are actively training for the mission. The crew will likely include at least one woman, a commitment NASA has made as part of the program's goals, and possibly the first person of color to walk on the Moon, though the specific crew assignment will depend on training progress and mission requirements. What these astronauts will experience, from the moment they strap into Orion for launch to the final moments before they return to Earth, will be unlike anything in the recent history of human spaceflight. The launch itself will be physically intense. The Space Launch System accelerates its crew to orbital velocity in roughly 8.5 minutes, during which the crew experiences forces that compress them into their seats with several times the normal force of gravity. The vibration and acoustic environment is significant even inside the heavily insulated Orion capsule. And then, with the engines cut, they will be weightless for the first time in a vehicle that is now traveling at nearly 8 kilometers per second, circling the planet every 90 minutes. The transition to a different lander, moving through a docking tunnel from the familiar interior of Orion into an entirely new vehicle that has never been inhabited by humans, will be one of the defining moments of the mission. Everything on the other side of that tunnel will be new territory in a very literal sense. What the crew will see when they look out of the windows of the lunar lander while in Earth orbit will be a view that has been available to astronauts on the International Space Station for decades. The brilliant blue arc of the Earth against the blackness of space, the Terminator line between day and night sweeping across continents, the glittering lights of cities at night. But they will be seeing it from inside hardware that has never before been entered by human beings, checking systems that have never before been operated by a human crew, and preparing procedures that have never been validated in actual space. The psychological dimensions of this are not trivial. Astronauts are highly trained professionals who are selected partly for their ability to perform under conditions of extreme novelty and uncertainty. But the combination of being inside a new spacecraft for the first time, in the hostile environment of space, running a checklist that has never been run before in this context, while being aware that the ultimate destination, the surface of the moon, depends on everything going right, creates a cognitive and emotional environment that is genuinely unique. Mission controllers on the ground will be monitoring every parameter of every system on both the Orion capsule and the lunar lander simultaneously, watching for anomalies, preparing contingency responses, and communicating with the crew through a communication architecture that has been designed to maintain contact even when the spacecraft moves briefly out of direct line of sight with Earth-based antennas. The 3 weeks allocated for the Earth orbit tests include scheduled rest periods and a structured cadence of activities designed to manage crew fatigue and maintain situational awareness. Long-duration space missions are, among other things, exercises in the management of human performance over time, making sure that the people on whom everything depends are not too tired, too stressed, or too cognitively loaded to make good decisions when it matters. After Artemis 3, assuming it succeeds, comes the uncrewed lunar landing test, the mission that will actually put one of these vehicles on the surface of the moon for the first time as a human-rated vehicle, albeit without humans on board. This test will be conducted with the lander that performed best during the Earth orbit evaluation, or, if NASA's assessment is that both performed well enough, potentially with both vehicles flying separate, uncrewed demonstrations. The vehicle will conduct its translunar injection, travel to the moon, enter lunar orbit, and then execute a powered descent to the surface of the lunar South Pole. The landing site selection for this mission is itself a complex scientific and engineering process. The lunar South Pole is not a uniform surface. It is a region of dramatic topography shaped by billions of years of impact history, featuring craters that range from small pits to enormous basins hundreds of kilometers across. The permanently shadowed craters, those whose geometry prevents sunlight from ever reaching the interior, are where the ice deposits are concentrated. But these craters are also the darkest, coldest, and most navigationally challenging parts of the landscape. Landing near, but not inside, a permanently shadowed crater requires a touchdown site that is accessible to the lander's sensors during descent, meaning enough light to navigate by, while also being close enough to the ice to allow access once a crew arrives. The interaction between the need for solar power, the desire for ice access, and the requirement for a flat, stable landing surface without too many large boulders creates a constrained optimization problem that mission planners have been working on for years, using orbital imagery from spacecraft like the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. The uncrewed landing test will validate the entire descent sequence under real lunar conditions: the approach profile, the hazard avoidance system that scans the surface in the final meters of descent and steers around obstacles, the touchdown sensor system, the propellant consumption during the powered descent, and the performance of the vehicle's landing legs on actual lunar regolith. Lunar regolith is not ordinary dirt. It is a complex material produced by billions of years of meteorite impacts, grinding the surface rocks of the moon into fine particles. The particles are sharp-edged because the moon has no weather or water to round them through abrasion. They are electrostatically charged, causing them to cling to surfaces. They are distributed in a range of grain sizes from fine powder to coarse gravel, and they present a set of mechanical challenges for landing vehicles. If the descent engines kick up too much dust in the final moments before touchdown, the dust can interfere with sensors, obscure visibility, and potentially damage thermal surfaces or moving parts. Apollo astronauts were instructed to shut down the descent engine at a certain altitude above the surface and allow the lander to fall the final few meters rather than risk disturbing the regolith with engine plume. Lunar Starship and Blue Moon will need their own approaches to this problem, verified by actual landing experience. All of these details, the dust management, the hazard avoidance, the regolith mechanics, the thermal environment, the navigation in the permanently shadowed crater's vicinity, represent the kind of engineering challenge that can be modeled and simulated extensively on Earth, but can only be truly validated by actually doing it on the moon. The uncrewed landing test will either confirm that the vehicle is ready for people, or it will reveal problems that need to be solved first. Either outcome is valuable. The outcome that would validate the readiness for a crewed mission is one in which the vehicle lands successfully, survives on the surface through at least one full lunar day-night cycle to test thermal performance, and ascends back to lunar orbit for orbital rendezvous demonstration. A lunar day is approximately 29.5 Earth days. A lunar night, during which temperatures drop to near negative 170 degrees Celsius at the poles, is equally long. The thermal challenge of surviving a lunar night with all systems operational is significant. Apollo missions stayed on the surface for only a few days and never had to contend with the full range of a lunar night. A vehicle designed for longer stays, and the vision for Artemis includes crewed stays of potentially a week or longer, must be able to maintain adequate temperatures for batteries, propellants, and electronic components through the extreme cold. This is not an unsolvable problem. Radioisotope heater units, small devices that use the natural decay of radioactive isotopes to generate warmth, have been used on planetary missions for decades. But they require careful integration with the vehicle's overall thermal architecture, and that integration has to work correctly in the actual lunar environment. After the uncrewed landing test, and after the data from it has been analysed, and any identified problems addressed, comes the moment that the entire program has been building toward: Artemis 4, the crewed lunar landing. By the time Artemis 4 launches, if the timeline holds, human beings will not have stood on the moon for more than 50 years. The gap between Apollo 17's departure from the lunar surface and the arrival of the first Artemis crew will span a longer period than the entirety of the Apollo program itself, from conception to completion. The crew of Artemis 4 will face a landing environment that is better understood than anything Apollo astronauts encountered, because of decades of orbital reconnaissance by spacecraft like the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, the L-Cross Impactor mission that confirmed the presence of water ice in permanently shadowed craters. India's Chandrayaan missions, China's Chang'e missions, and other lunar explorers. They will also be equipped with navigation systems, communication infrastructure, and life support technology that is significantly more capable than what was available in 1969. But they will be there, on the surface of another world, in suits that depend on systems that have never been fully tested in exactly this environment, in a vehicle that may be flying its second or third crewed mission, in a location that is more remote from Earth than any human being has been since the final Apollo mission. The fundamental character of what they are doing standing somewhere that is not the Earth, dependent on their own skill and the reliability of their equipment for survival, has not changed since Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. What has changed is the context. They will not be there to plant a flag and come home. They will be there to begin the work of making the lunar South Pole accessible for what comes next. A series of increasingly capable missions, building over years and decades towards something that looks like a sustained human presence on the moon. NASA's long-range plans include a small habitat called the Gateway in lunar orbit, a platform that can serve as a staging base for surface missions and as a waypoint for eventual missions to Mars. The Gateway will not be ready for early Artemis missions, but its development is proceeding in parallel, with international partners including the European Space Agency, the Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency, and the Canadian Space Agency contributing hardware and systems. The vision, extended over a long enough timeline, is a human presence on the moon that is not measured in days but in weeks, months, and eventually the kind of continuous rotation that defines the International Space Station. Crews would travel to the Gateway, descend to the surface, conduct extended science and resource development operations, return to the Gateway, and come home with the next crew already on its way before the previous one departs. Whether this vision will be realized on any particular timeline is uncertain. It depends on political continuity, on technical progress that must be measured against reality rather than aspiration, on the economic viability of the commercial lander systems, and on the geopolitical dynamics that will unfold over the coming decade. But the physical foundation for it is being built right now, in test facilities and launch pads and design offices, where engineers are doing the detailed work that separates the history books from the drawing boards. The science that will eventually be done at the lunar South Pole is itself worth understanding, because it is not merely symbolic or exploratory in the way that Apollo science was. Even though Apollo produced genuinely important scientific results, the water ice in permanently shadowed craters near the South Pole is a record of materials delivered to the inner solar system over billions of years, comets, asteroids, and other bodies that carried volatile compounds from the outer solar system. Analyzing that ice provides information about the history of water in the inner solar system, with implications for understanding how Earth's oceans formed and, potentially, how life originated on our planet. The variety of compounds present in the ice, not just water, but potentially also organic molecules, carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and other volatiles, makes it a chemical archive of extraordinary scientific value. The regolith itself contains a record of solar activity over billions of years. Because the moon has no atmosphere and no plate tectonics to erase or bury evidence, the solar wind particles embedded in the top layers of regolith document the history of the sun's output over geological time. This information is scientifically irreplaceable. It cannot be obtained from Earth-based observations or from any other source. The permanently shadowed craters are also among the coldest places in the solar system, colder, in fact, than the surface temperature of Pluto. Studying the chemistry that occurs at those temperatures, in the interaction between ice, rock, and the tenuous flux of cosmic radiation that penetrates the vacuum above, may reveal reactions and compounds that have no analogue in any environment studied on Earth or in any Earth-orbiting laboratory. And beyond the pure science, there is the engineering knowledge that will be generated by actually operating on the lunar surface, in the conditions of the South Pole. Knowledge about how equipment behaves in extreme cold, how humans perform in the reduced gravity of the moon over extended stays, how the regolith interacts with machinery and suits and habitats, and how the resource extraction and processing that the long-term vision requires can actually be made to work in practice. All of this begins with Artemis 3, not the landing, but the test that validates the hardware that will make the landing possible. The 3 weeks in Earth orbit that will determine whether the technology is ready, and if it is not, what needs to be fixed. It is a mission that will be difficult to watch, not because it is dramatic in the way of a lunar landing, but because so much of what is important about it will be invisible to cameras and incomprehensible without engineering context. The significance is in the data, in the checklists completed and anomalies noted, in the suit pressurizations and propellant transfers and docking maneuvers that will either validate or challenge the assumptions that the entire subsequent program rests on. But it is also genuinely exciting in the quieter, deeper way that real progress often is the kind of progress that does not announce itself with spectacular imagery, but shows up years later as the difference between a mission that worked and one that did not. The open questions that will remain after Artemis 3 are substantial. The orbital refueling demonstrations will provide data, but the full-scale transfer needed for an actual lunar mission will be larger and more complex than anything tested during the Earth orbit phase. The suits will be tested in vacuum, but not in the reduced gravity of the lunar surface, which changes the biomechanics of movement in ways that microgravity does not replicate. The landers will be evaluated by a crew of 4, but their performance over the much longer duration of a complete lunar mission, including the time on the surface and the ascent back to orbit, will remain unverified until the actual landing. The competition between SpaceX and Blue Origin will continue to intensify as Artemis 3 approaches. Both companies are aware that their position in what may become the most valuable commercial space market of the 21st century lunar transportation and infrastructure depends on how they perform in this program. The winner of the Artemis lander competition will not just have the satisfaction of completing a historic mission, they will have established themselves as the company that has actually done it, with all the reputational, contractual, and commercial advantages that follow from that. The possibility that both companies eventually demonstrate reliable lunar landing capability, and that NASA ends up with a competitive marketplace for lunar transportation rather than a single provider, is not fanciful. It is arguably the ideal outcome from NASA's perspective and from the perspective of the long-term development of lunar infrastructure. Competition drives down costs, drives up performance, and provides redundancy against the failure of any single provider. But getting to that future requires getting through the near term, the test flights, the demonstrations, the Artemis 3 shakedown, the uncrewed landing, and the first crewed landing with the hardware functioning, the crews safe, and the program maintaining the political and financial support it needs to continue. In the decades and centuries that follow, if the vision of sustained human presence on the moon is ultimately realized, the work being done now will be seen as foundational. The engineers designing orbital refueling systems, the technicians building suit components, the mission planners working out rendezvous trajectories, the test pilots training for procedures no one has ever flown before. They are the people building the first true infrastructure for humanity's expansion beyond Earth. That is not a small thing to be part of, and it is not a small thing to be alive to witness. There is something worth examining more closely about the role of failure in the development of Starship, because the public narrative around it is often misleading in ways that matter for understanding where the program actually stands. From the outside, the sequence of Starship test flights, many of which ended in explosions, either planned or unplanned, can look like a series of failures. This interpretation is understandable. rockets exploding is dramatic and memorable, and the visual vocabulary of rocket failures tends to dominate public perception. But this is not how SpaceX, or most serious aerospace engineers, understand what happened. Each test flight was designed to gather specific data. Each explosion, and more precisely, each set of anomalous readings, unexpected behaviors, and off-nominal events across every flight, successful or not, generated information that fed into the next iteration of the design. This approach, which SpaceX calls test to failure or build, fly, iterate, is philosophically different from the approach used in traditional government aerospace programs, where extensive ground testing and analysis is supposed to catch problems before a vehicle is ever flown. Both approaches have merits. The traditional approach reduces the probability of dramatic public failures, but it is slow, expensive, and sometimes leads to failures that are harder to diagnose precisely because the testing environment is so different from actual flight. The build, fly, iterate approach accepts public failures as a cost of moving faster. It is messier, more visible, and requires a cultural tolerance for setbacks that is not natural to most large organizations. SpaceX has that culture. Whether it can be applied successfully to a vehicle intended to carry human beings, where the tolerance for failure is fundamentally different, is one of the central questions of the entire Artemis program. The distinction between an unmanned test flight that explodes and a crewed mission that fails is obviously enormous in human terms, but it is also important engineering context. The level of reliability required for a human-rated spacecraft is categorically higher than for an expendable cargo launcher. The systems must be verified, the redundancies must be tested, the failure modes must be understood and mitigated, and the probability of catastrophic failure across the entire mission must be reduced to a level that is acceptable not to engineers who understand the technical risks, but to the families of the people being asked to fly on the vehicle. NASA has spent considerable effort developing the certification standards that SpaceX and Blue Origin must meet to fly their vehicles with crew. Those standards draw on decades of experience with the Space Shuttle program, including the catastrophic losses of Challenger in 1986 and Columbia in 2003, and incorporate lessons learned at 10D, considerable cost about what kinds of failures happen when organizational pressures override engineering judgment. Whether SpaceX's development approach can produce a vehicle that meets those standards on the timeline that Artemis requires is genuinely uncertain. The company's track record in Earth orbit, hundreds of successful launches, routine reuse of boosters that have flown a dozen times or more, provides meaningful evidence of engineering competence. But lunar operations are a step change in complexity and risk, and the consequences of a failure during a crewed lunar mission are much harder to recover from than a failure in Earth orbit. The same questions apply to Blue Origin, which has less flight heritage than SpaceX, but is bringing a methodical, detailed engineering approach to the Lunar Lander challenge. Blue Origin's history of moving slowly and carefully, while sometimes frustrating to observers who wanted faster progress, may prove to be an advantage in the reliability-critical domain of crewed lunar operations. The question of which approach SpaceX's aggressive iteration or Blue Origin's careful, methodical development ultimately produces the better human landing system is not a question that current events have answered. It is a question that the next several years of testing and evaluation will answer, with the verdict rendered by the data from actual flight rather than from predictions or promises. Both companies have made enormous public commitments about what their vehicles will be capable of and when. Both companies have also, at various points, acknowledged that their timelines have slipped relative to earlier projections. The history of ambitious aerospace programs, commercial and governmental alike, is replete with examples of forecasts that proved optimistic. This does not mean the goals are unachievable. It means that the uncertainty is genuine, and that the appropriate response is to maintain the pressure of a competitive program while also building in the margins and the testing philosophy that can identify and address problems before they become catastrophic. This is, fundamentally, what the Artemis 3 Earth orbit test is designed to accomplish. There is a final dimension to this story that has received less attention than the engineering and the geopolitics, but that may ultimately be the most important of all, the economic dimension. The Moon is not just a scientific destination or a strategic location in a geopolitical competition. It is, potentially, a place with substantial economic value that does not require a single dramatic discovery or technological breakthrough to unlock, but that accumulates as the infrastructure for sustained access develops. The water ice at the lunar South Pole is the most obvious resource. But the Moon also contains significant deposits of helium-3, an isotope that is rare on Earth but has been implanted in the lunar regolith by the solar wind over billions of years. Helium-3 is a potential fuel for a type of nuclear fusion reactor that would produce far less radioactive waste than conventional fusion approaches. The quantities available on the Moon, if extractable, could potentially provide centuries' worth of energy for human civilization. The technology to use it does not yet exist in commercially viable form, but if it ever does, the country or company that controls helium-3 extraction from the Moon will be in an extraordinary economic position. More practically, the platinum group metals that are found in the asteroids that have impacted the lunar surface over geological time are present in the regolith in concentrations that, while diffuse, are potentially interesting at very large scale. The Moon also contains iron, aluminum, and silicon in forms that could, in principle, be extracted and used for construction in space, eliminating the enormous cost of launching building materials from Earth. None of these resources can be practically accessed until there is a functioning supply chain for getting to the Moon and operating there sustainably. The early Artemis missions are not resource extraction missions. They are the precursor missions that will establish whether such a supply chain is physically possible and economically viable. The commercial lunar services industry companies that want to deliver payloads to the lunar surface for scientific, governmental, and commercial customers has already begun to develop around the architecture that Artemis is building. NASA's Commercial Lunar Payload Services program has contracted with multiple companies to deliver scientific instruments and technology demonstrations to the lunar surface before and alongside the crewed missions. These missions, beginning with small robotic landers, are building operational experience and demonstrating commercial viability for an industry that did not exist a decade ago. The trajectory leads, over a long enough timeline, towards something that has been described as a cislunar economy, a network of commercial activity in the space between Earth and the Moon, encompassing transportation, resource extraction, manufacturing, communications, and eventually tourism and permanent habitation. This is a vision that requires decades to materialize and faces enormous technical and economic uncertainties. But the investment being made in the Artemis program is part of what makes it plausible rather than purely speculative. The immediate question for anyone following the program in real time is a simpler and more immediate one. Will it work? Will the Starship and Blue Moon landers be ready for Artemis 3? Will the orbital refueling demonstrations succeed? Will the suits perform in vacuum? Will the program maintain the political and financial support it needs through the inevitable delays and setbacks that will occur between now and the first crewed lunar landing? These questions cannot be answered with certainty today, but they are being worked on actively, urgently, by some of the most capable engineers and managers in the world, in a context that is more competitive, more commercially driven, and more geopolitically urgent than anything in the history of human space exploration since the original race to the Moon. The outcome of this effort will shape the trajectory of human civilization beyond Earth for generations, And the next few years will tell us, with the clarity that only actual flights can provide, whether the technology is ready, whether the companies can execute, and whether the path to a genuinely multi-planetary human presence has been opened, or whether it will require more time and more work than the current moment of optimism suggests. Whatever the answer turns out to be, the story of how we got here, the technical evolution from Apollo to shuttle, to the commercial spaceflight era, the political decisions that shaped the Artemis program, the competition between SpaceX and Blue Origin, the geopolitical pressure from China, is a genuinely fascinating chapter in the long history of what human beings do when they look up at the sky and ask what is out there. The moon is still there. It is the same moon that humans walked on half a century ago. The same moon that has hung in the sky over every human civilization throughout history. The same moon that inspired so much of the mythology and art and science and longing that runs through the whole of human culture. But for the first time in 50 years, the path back to its surface is not theoretical. It is a matter of engineering and execution. And the people and machines that will make it real are in motion right now, working toward a moment that will be remembered long after the political and commercial context that produced it has faded into history. That moment, whenever it comes, will belong to everyone who looked up and wondered. To fully appreciate what is being built for the Artemis program, it is worth going back even further than Apollo, back to the fundamental physics of why getting to the moon is so hard, and why the solutions being developed now represent such a genuine departure from everything that came before. The problem, at its core, is something called the Tsiolkovsky rocket equation, a mathematical relationship derived by Russian scientist Konstantin Tsiolkovsky in the 1890s that has governed the entire history of space exploration. The equation relates the change in velocity a rocket can achieve to the ratio of its initial mass, fully fueled, to its final mass, after the propellant is consumed, multiplied by a factor determined by the efficiency of the engine. The practical consequence of this equation is brutal. To increase a rocket's velocity by a given amount, the required mass of propellant grows exponentially. Doubling the required velocity change does not double the propellant requirement, it squares it, or worse, depending on the specific relationship. This is why rockets are mostly propellant. A large rocket sitting on a launch pad is typically 85 to 90% propellant by mass, with the actual payload, the spacecraft, the crew capsule, the instruments representing a small fraction of the total. Getting to the moon requires a velocity change of roughly 12 kilometers per second, accounting for the launch from Earth's surface, the escape from Earth's gravitational influence, the journey to the moon, the orbital insertion at the moon, and the descent to the surface. Getting back requires another sequence of velocity changes for ascent, orbital rendezvous, and the return to Earth. The total mission delta V, as engineers call it, is enormous. The Saturn V addressed this problem with sheer size. It was the largest rocket ever built to that point, standing 110 meters tall and weighing nearly 3 million kilograms fully fueled. It carried approximately 45,000 kilograms of payload to low Earth orbit, of which a smaller but still substantial fraction made it all the way to the lunar surface. Even so, the Apollo lunar module, the vehicle that actually landed on the moon, was a remarkably minimal spacecraft. It had essentially no margins, no redundancy beyond what was absolutely required, and no ability to remain on the surface for more than a few days. The ascent stage had room for 2 astronauts standing upright. There were no seats to save weight, and carried just enough propellant to return them to lunar orbit, nothing more. The limitation was the Tsiolkovsky equation. Every extra kilogram of mass in the lunar module required additional propellant in the descent stage to land it, additional propellant in the lunar module ascent stage to lift it back off, additional propellant in the lunar orbit stage to carry it, additional propellant in the translunar injection stage to send it, and so on, cascading backward through every stage of the mission. Starship addresses this problem with a fundamentally different strategy. Rather than optimizing relentlessly for minimum mass, which produces a vehicle that is minimally capable and extremely fragile, Starship accepts the mass penalty of a large, robust spacecraft and addresses the propellant problem through orbital refueling. The vehicle launches with enough propellant to reach orbit. Additional propellant is brought up by tanker flights. The lunar Starship tops off its tanks in orbit and then has enough propellant for the complete mission to the lunar surface and back. This approach requires more total launches. It requires the orbital refueling technology that has never been demonstrated. But it produces a lunar lander that can carry much more payload, can spend longer on the surface, and has the engineering margins that make it more likely to work reliably over many missions. Blue Moon's architecture, while different in propellant choice and overall configuration, reflects a similar logic. Liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen are higher performance propellants than methane. They produce more thrust per kilogram of propellant, which means that Blue Moon can carry more payload per unit of propellant mass. The trade-off is that liquid hydrogen is extremely difficult to handle, being the second coldest liquid in regular industrial use after liquid helium, with very low density and a strong tendency to boil off if not carefully managed. Blue Origin has significant experience with liquid hydrogen from the B-3 engine that powers New Shepard's upper stage and is applying that experience to the scale challenges of Blue Moon. What both vehicles represent, in the context of the Tsiolkovsky equation's constraints, is an approach that does not try to escape the physics. No approach can do that, but rather organizes the mission architecture to manage those physics in a way that produces useful payloads and genuine operational capability, rather than the minimal survival capability of Apollo. The difference matters not just for the initial Artemis missions, but for everything that follows. A lunar lander that can deliver several tons of payload to the surface, rather than a few hundred kilograms, enables a completely different kind of surface operation. It can deliver habitat components, power generation equipment, drilling hardware for ice extraction experiments, scientific instruments that would be impossible to carry on a minimal vehicle, and the supplies needed for an extended stay. It enables the beginning of an actual presence on the moon rather than a visit. This is why the outcome of the Artemis program matters in ways that go beyond the symbolism of a first landing. The vehicles being developed for this program, if they work as designed, are the foundation of a lunar transportation infrastructure that could support sustained operations for decades. The investment in making them work is an investment in a future that is qualitatively different from everything that has come before. It is also why the competition between SpaceX and Blue Origin is more consequential than any previous competition in human spaceflight. The winner does not just get to say they built the first commercial lunar lander. They get to define the architecture of lunar transportation for the next generation of missions. The operational experience, the contractual relationships, the public trust, the internal knowledge, all of it accumulates to the company that gets there first and gets it right. This competitive dynamic is not just healthy from an economic standpoint, it is arguably essential from a safety standpoint. When there is only one provider of a critical capability, the incentive to maintain that provider's goodwill, to overlook performance concerns, to accept slipping schedules, to tolerate technical shortcomings becomes enormous. Having two companies competing for the same contract creates a situation where neither can afford to be the slower, less reliable, or more expensive option. That pressure, maintained over time, tends to produce better outcomes for everyone who depends on the systems being built. The astronauts who will fly on Artemis 4, whoever they turn out to be, will benefit from everything that went into the competition between SpaceX and Blue Origin, even if they never know the details. The decisions made in the engineering trade studies, the failures that drove redesigns, the innovations that one company developed and the other was forced to match, the testing that was done because a competitor was also testing, all of it will be built into the vehicle that carries them to the surface of the moon. That is, In a quiet way, one of the most powerful things about the commercial model that NASA has adopted for this program. It harnesses the best energies of human competition, the drive to win, the refusal to accept being second best, the constant search for advantage in service of a mission that is fundamentally cooperative, returning human beings safely to the surface of another world and beginning the long work of making that world accessible to more of us. The story of Artemis 3 is, at its deepest level, a story about preparation, about the commitment to do the hard work of testing and verification before putting lives at risk in a place where the consequences of failure are irrecoverable, about the recognition that genuine progress requires not just ambition but patience, the patience to do the less glamorous work, the Earth orbit tests and the system checkouts and the suit verifications, before attempting the thing that everyone is ultimately trying to accomplish. It is also a story about the particular moment in history we happen to inhabit, a moment when the tools to make ambitious space exploration economically viable are, for the first time, genuinely within reach. Reusable rockets, commercially developed spacecraft, orbital refueling, advanced materials and manufacturing techniques that can produce stronger, lighter structures more reliably than anything available in the Apollo era. Guidance and navigation systems that can land a vehicle precisely on a terrain it has never seen before, in real time, with no human intervention. Communications and computing infrastructure that supports mission operations of a complexity that would have been impossible to coordinate in the 1960s. All of these things exist now. Some of them barely existed 10 years ago. The combination of them, applied to the problem of returning to the moon, is what makes this moment genuinely different from all the previous moments in the past 50 years, when returning to the moon was discussed but not achieved. Whether Artemis 3 launches on schedule, whether both landers are ready, whether the orbital refueling demonstrations succeed on the first attempt, all of these outcomes are genuinely uncertain. Space is hard. Schedules slip. Problems arise that were not anticipated. The history of ambitious programs in this domain is littered with optimistic projections that reality revised downward. But the trajectory is real. The hardware exists. The rockets are flying. The competition is genuine. And the outcome, whatever its specific shape, will bring human beings back to the moon within the next few years, and, in doing so, will open a chapter in human history that does not yet have a name because the story it will tell has not yet been written. The people writing that story with their hands on flight controls, with their eyes on engineering displays, with their minds working through contingencies at 3 a.m. in mission control rooms around the world, deserve the attention of everyone who has ever looked up at the night sky and felt, even for a moment, the pull of what lies beyond. One of the most underappreciated aspects of the current lunar program is the international dimension, not just the competition with China, but the network of partner nations that has assembled around the United States and the Artemis Accords framework to build a genuinely collaborative return to the moon. The Artemis Accords, first established in 2020, represent an attempt to create a set of shared norms for lunar exploration that goes beyond the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. They include principles such as the peaceful use of space, the importance of transparency in space operations, the release of scientific data for the benefit of humanity, and the registration of space objects. They also address the thornier question of resource extraction, affirming that the extraction of space resources does not inherently constitute a claim of national sovereignty over a celestial body, which is a practical carve-out from the Outer Space Treaty's blanket prohibition on territorial claims. As of the mid-2020s, more than 30 nations have signed the accords, including European allies, Japan, Canada, Australia, the United Arab Emirates, and many others. Canada's contribution to the Artemis program is particularly tangible. The Canadian Space Agency is providing Canadarm3, a robotic system for the Gateway space station, and a Canadian astronaut has been assigned to fly on Artemis 2, the first non-American to fly to the vicinity of the Moon since the Apollo program. Japan's JAXA has signed partnership agreements that include potential contribution of hardware to the Gateway and participation in lunar surface exploration activities. The European Space Agency has been a key partner through its provision of the service module for the Orion capsule, the hardware that provides propulsion, power, and other critical systems for the crew capsule. Without the European service module, Orion would not be capable of the missions it has flown. This international network is not purely altruistic. Each partner nation brings political legitimacy, additional resources, and specific technical capabilities that NASA cannot efficiently develop on its own. In return, they gain access to the most capable human lunar exploration program ever attempted, opportunities for their astronauts to reach the Moon, and an alignment of their space programs with the most ambitious human spaceflight effort of the 21st century. The nations that have not signed the accords, China and Russia, most prominently, are, in geopolitical terms, defined partly by this absence. They are pursuing their own lunar programs with their own frameworks and their own international partnerships. Russia's cooperation with China on lunar exploration represents a significant consolidation of capabilities that might otherwise have remained separated. Russia has deep experience with certain aspects of space operations, long-duration crewed spaceflight, life support systems, space station operations that complements China's emerging capabilities in launch vehicles and robotic lunar missions. The resulting landscape is one in which the Moon, for the first time since the original space race, is a contested domain, a place where multiple powers with different values, different interests, and different visions of the future are converging. The outcome of that convergence is not predetermined. It will be shaped by the decisions made over the next decade about what presence to establish, in what locations, with what kinds of infrastructure, under what legal and political frameworks. Understanding this context is important for evaluating the urgency that NASA expresses about the Artemis timeline. The agency is not simply trying to beat a schedule for its own sake. It is trying to establish presence and precedent before the environment in which presence and precedent are established has been shaped by others. Once another power has a permanent installation on the lunar South Pole near the ice deposits, in the permanently lit regions that provide reliable solar power, at the most strategically valuable terrain features, the options available to subsequent arrivals are constrained. This is not a hypothetical future concern. China's Chang'e 6 mission, launched in 2024, landed in the South Pole Aitken Basin on the far side of the Moon and returned samples to Earth, the first samples ever collected from the lunar far side. The mission demonstrated Chinese capability to operate in the southern lunar regions, to conduct precision landing, and to complete a sample return from a highly challenging environment. It was a genuine technical achievement, and it was explicitly framed by Chinese officials as part of a roadmap leading to crewed lunar landing. The timeline China has stated for that crewed landing sometime before 2035, with some analysts believing the actual date could be earlier, is not necessarily in direct competition with Artemis 4. Both programs might complete their first crewed landings in the late 2020s or early 2030s without directly interfering with each other. The more consequential competition is the one that follows. Who builds the first permanent infrastructure? Who extracts the first resources? Who establishes the first long-duration human presence in the permanently lit regions near the southern pole? These are the decisions that will matter for the next century of human activity in space. The technical differences between the Chinese and American approaches to lunar exploration reflect their different institutional histories and current capabilities. China's lunar program has been built on a foundation of meticulous, incremental development, with each Chang'e mission significantly more ambitious than its predecessor. Chang'e 1 and 2 were lunar orbiters. Chang'e 3 deployed a small rover. Chang'e 4 landed on the far side. Chang'e 5 returned samples. Each mission demonstrated the capabilities needed for the next. The Long March 5 rocket, which launched Chang'e 5 and 6, has demonstrated the payload capacity needed for ambitious lunar missions. China is developing larger rockets, the Long March 9, with capabilities that would rival or exceed the Space Launch System. The Chinese crewed lunar lander program, known internally as various designations within the China Manned Space Program, is using a two-launch architecture. A separate propulsion module and a crew lander would launch separately, dock in lunar orbit, and conduct the landing. This is conceptually similar to the Apollo architecture, though with more modern technology throughout. What China has that the original Apollo program did not is the full accumulation of 60 years of knowledge about materials, electronics, manufacturing, guidance systems, communications, and computational power that has been generated since 1969. A Chinese lunar lander built in the 1960s using 1960s technology would have been approximately as capable as the Apollo lunar module. A Chinese lunar lander built in the 2020s is, in many respects, a fundamentally more capable vehicle, even if it follows a similar architectural approach. The ability of both the United States and China to put credible lunar infrastructure in place in the late 2020s and early 2030s will create a political and strategic situation that the international community will have to navigate carefully. The legal frameworks that currently exist were not designed for this reality. The Outer Space Treaty's prohibition on sovereignty claims does not clearly address the right to establish an exclusive operational zone around a specific installation on the lunar surface, the kind of arrangement that would be necessary for practical reasons around a power generation station or a resource extraction facility. These questions are being worked on by lawyers, diplomats, and policy analysts at institutions around the world. Their answers will matter enormously, but they cannot substitute for the physical fact of presence, and that is why the missions matter. The Artemis 3 Earth orbit test, in this context, is not just an engineering milestone. It is a step in a sequence of actions that will determine who is on the moon when the hard conversations about governance and resource access and territorial proximity begin. Being present, having established operational capability, having the infrastructure already in place, these things create facts on the ground, or in this case, facts on the regolith, that shape negotiating positions and political dynamics in ways that no treaty text or diplomatic note can fully substitute for. This is not a comfortable framing for a program that is officially about science and exploration and the benefit of all humankind, but it is an honest one. The people who are building Starship and Blue Moon and the Orion capsule and the Space Launch System know it. The officials at NASA and the State Department and the National Security Council know it. And the people designing the Chinese Chang'e follow-on missions know it too. Space has always been, simultaneously, about the deepest aspirations of the human species and about the most immediate and concrete calculations of national interest. The best of it, the science, the exploration, the expansion of knowledge, tends to emerge despite the calculations, or sometimes because of the competitive energy they generate. The Apollo program produced genuine science, genuine wonder, and genuine inspiration, partly because it was also a Cold War competition that gave powerful people powerful reasons to fund it. The Artemis program inherits this double nature. It is genuinely about exploration. It is also genuinely about strategic positioning. The astronauts who fly these missions will be real people doing something genuinely extraordinary. They will also be participants in a geopolitical contest that neither they nor anyone else has the ability to fully separate from the act of exploration itself. This is, ultimately, what makes the story so compelling and so difficult to tell simply. It cannot be reduced to a narrative of pure heroism or pure competition or pure science or pure politics. It is all of these things at once, in proportions that shift with the telling and with the perspective of the teller. What we can say, setting aside the complexity, is this. In the next several years, for the first time in the lifetimes of most of the people alive today, human beings will set foot on another world. The specific details of how that happens, which rocket, which lander, which crew, from which launch pad, on which date, are genuinely uncertain. But the direction of travel is not. The machines are being built, the rockets are being flown, the mission is being designed, the people are being trained. The moon is the first destination. It is not, in the vision of everyone working on these programs, the last. The asteroid belt, with its enormous concentrations of metallic resources, Mars, the planet that has been dreamed about as a human destination for more than a century. The moons of Jupiter and Saturn, some of which harbour the conditions that might support life. The distant reaches of the outer solar system, where the sun is just the brightest star in a sky full of stars. None of these destinations are accessible with the technology that exists today, but all of them become more accessible with every advance in propulsion, life support, navigation, and manufacturing that is being driven by the urgency of returning to the moon. The work being done now is not just about the moon. It is about building the capabilities and the knowledge and the institutional experience that will eventually take us further. That is a long arc. The people working on Artemis 3 will not live to see the end of it. Perhaps no one alive today will, but they are part of it, part of the long, intermittent, contested, expensive, magnificent process by which a species that evolved on a single planet has been, slowly and with great difficulty, learning to live beyond it. In the short term, what matters is whether the hardware works, whether the landers dock correctly, whether the suits hold pressure, whether the propellant transfers succeed, whether the crews come home safely. These immediate questions dominate the attention of the engineers and managers and astronauts who are doing the actual work. But in the background, always, is the longer question, the one that makes all the detail and difficulty worthwhile. The question of what comes next, and after that, and after that. The answer to that question is still being written, and Artemis 3 is one of the paragraphs. Let us return, for a moment, to the surface of the moon itself, to the physical experience of what future astronauts will actually encounter, because it is something that no camera or sensor can fully communicate, and that represents one of the most genuinely alien environments any human being will ever inhabit. The moon's gravity is approximately 1/6 that of Earth. You weigh about 17% of your Earth weight on the lunar surface. The practical effects of this are both intuitive and counterintuitive. The intuitive part, things fall more slowly, jumps take longer, the physical effort of moving your own body mass is reduced. The counterintuitive part, your inertia, your resistance to changes in direction, remains the same as on Earth, because inertia depends on mass, not weight. This means that starting to move, stopping, turning, and changing direction all feel strange in ways that take time to adjust to. Apollo astronauts reported that the loping gait they developed, the characteristic bunny hop motion visible in Apollo footage, was partly a deliberate adaptation to the unusual physics, and partly an emergent behavior that their bodies discovered through trial and error. The reduced gravity also means that the lunar surface operations are inherently different from what training in Earth gravity or even underwater training can fully prepare you for. The neutral buoyancy pool at Johnson Space Center approximates weightlessness reasonably well, but 1/6 gravity is its own distinct regime. The way tools feel in your hands, the way your suit interacts with the terrain, the way balance and proprioception work, all of these are genuinely different, and no amount of simulation on Earth can replicate the specific combination of the real lunar gravity, the real lunar terrain, the real vacuum, and the real psychological context of being there. The lunar surface at the South Pole is not the flat, uniform basaltic plain that the Apollo missions explored in the equatorial regions. The South Pole is ancient, heavily cratered, highland terrain, geologically much older and more complex than the Maria, the dark volcanic plains that cover much of the Moon's near side, and that provided Apollo with relatively flat landing sites. At the South Pole, the terrain is rugged, with slopes and crater walls and ridges, and the kind of surface variation that requires careful navigation both on foot and in any surface vehicles. The lighting conditions at the South Pole are unlike anything in the Apollo experience. Apollo missions landed on a surface where the sun climbed to moderate angles above the horizon, providing reasonably even illumination. At the South Pole, the sun never rises more than a few degrees above the horizon, even in the areas of perpetual near sunlight. The result is extreme shadows. Every boulder, every small crater, every feature of the terrain casts a long shadow that can completely obscure what lies within it. Depth perception becomes difficult because the familiar visual cues that humans use to judge distance and surface texture rely on lighting that does not exist at the pole. Navigating a spacesuit EVA or driving a rover in these conditions requires both training and technology that Apollo crews never needed. The thermal environment is extreme in a different way than in the equatorial regions. In the areas of near-permanent sunlight that the mission will target, the surface temperature can exceed 100 degrees Celsius when the sun is at its low angle. In the shadows a few meters away, it can drop to near -200 degrees. The spacesuit must manage this range continuously, moving in and out of shadows as the astronauts work, switching between intense solar radiation and extreme cold within seconds. The thermal management system in the Axiom suits has been designed for this, but validating it in actual lunar conditions is something that will only be possible when someone is actually wearing the suit on the surface. The dust is another factor that was underestimated in the early planning for moon exploration, and that the experience of Apollo helped to define more clearly. Lunar regolith is abrasive at a microscopic level that has no equivalent in terrestrial soils. It sticks to everything, to suits, to instruments, to connectors, to visors. It worked its way into the mechanisms of Apollo equipment in ways that degraded performance and, on some occasions, caused genuine concern. The famous incident during Apollo 17 when Harrison Schmitt's suit fender extension broke off, allowing regolith to spray onto him and the rover during EVA drives, illustrates how a minor equipment failure can have significant operational consequences. For longer duration missions, the multi-week stays that the later Artemis missions are targeting dust management becomes a genuine operational challenge. How do you keep it out of the habitat airlock? How do you prevent it from being tracked into pressurized areas where breathing it would be a health hazard? How do you maintain the optical clarity of helmet visors over multiple EVA cycles? These are not glamorous problems, but they are real problems, and they have to be solved before long-duration surface operations are feasible. The Axiom suit design incorporates lessons from Apollo about some of these challenges. The outer fabric layers are designed for better abrasion resistance. The joint mechanisms are designed to be more tolerant of particle contamination. The visor coatings are designed to shed dust more effectively. Whether these design choices are adequate for the actual lunar South Pole environment will only be known after the suits have been used there. The psychological dimension of the lunar South Pole environment is also worth considering. The perpetual low sun angle, the stark contrast between brilliant illumination and absolute darkness, the silence that is total because there is no atmosphere to carry sound, the isolation from Earth at a distance that introduces a communication delay of more than a second each way. All of these create a perceptual environment that is qualitatively different from anything in normal human experience, and different in specific ways from the Apollo equatorial experience as well. The astronauts who went to the moon in the Apollo era described experiences that ranged from profound awe to focused professional concentration to occasional moments of genuine disorientation. They were on the surface, for at most a few days. Future Artemis crews will be there longer and in a more demanding environment. The human factors research that informs long-duration mission planning drawn from experience in the International Space Station, Antarctic research stations, submarine service, and other analogous environments will be applied to managing the psychological demands of extended South Pole operations. All of this is known, studied, and being addressed in the design of the missions, the training of the crews, and the development of the hardware. But it is being addressed with the honest acknowledgement that some of what will be found can only be found by actually being there. This is the nature of exploration. It is the nature that has characterized every major expansion of human experience, from the first crossings of large bodies of water to the first ascents of high mountains to the first ventures into the stratosphere. The preparations are thorough, the training is extensive, the simulations are as realistic as technology allows. And then, eventually, someone actually goes, and what they find there informs everything that follows. Artemis 3 is the preparation mission, the last major step before the going. It is the mission that turns theory into verified fact, that catches the failures that simulations miss, and that gives the people who will actually descend to the surface the confidence that the machines they are trusting their lives to have been tested as thoroughly as the mission architecture allows. The weight of that, the responsibility that falls on everyone involved in making this mission work, is not something that the engineers and managers and astronauts take lightly. The history of human spaceflight includes moments when that responsibility was not fully honored, when institutional pressures overrode engineering judgment, and when the consequences were catastrophic. Those moments are part of the culture, the training, and the decision-making processes that govern every aspect of these programs. The goal is to make the mission that follows the actual crewed lunar landing as close to routine as a mission to the surface of the moon can ever be. Routine does not mean simple or unchallenging or devoid of risk. It means that every known risk has been identified, assessed, and addressed to the extent possible. It means that the crew has been trained for every foreseeable contingency. It means that the hardware has been tested in conditions as close to the operational environment as can be achieved before the operational mission itself. That is what Artemis 3 is working toward. And when it is done, and when the data has been analysed, and when the lessons have been incorporated into the next iteration of the mission design, the long journey of the human species back to the surface of the moon will be ready for its next chapter. The details of that chapter, the names of the crew, the precise landing site, the specific scientific objectives, the weather on the day of launch, the small moments of humour and human warmth that always emerge when people are doing difficult things under extreme pressure are still unknown. They are part of a future that is being built right now by people who know the history of what came before and who are determined to get this right. When that future arrives, it will feel both new and ancient new, because human beings will be doing something that has not happened in half a century, and ancient because the moon has been there for 4.5 billion years, and the impulse that drives us toward it is as old as the first human being who looked up at the night sky and wondered. That impulse does not go away. It is what we are made of, and it is what has brought us, after all the delays and detours and false starts, back to the threshold of the place we first left in 1972. The story is not finished. It is barely begun. The record of what has already been accomplished in the years leading up to this moment deserves more recognition than it typically receives, because the progress has been real and the challenges that were overcome were not trivial. The Space Launch System, for all the criticism directed at its cost and development time, has now flown twice successfully. The most powerful rocket currently operational on Earth has demonstrated that it can deliver an Orion capsule to deep space and bring it back safely. The heat shield, one of the most technically demanding components of the system, which must absorb the ferocious heating of atmospheric re-entry at lunar return velocity, worked on Artemis 1 and was verified again on Artemis 2. These are not small achievements. Returning from the moon is, from a thermal engineering standpoint, significantly more demanding than returning from the space station, because the spacecraft is moving much faster when it hits the atmosphere. The Orion capsule itself represents decades of learning about life support, avionics, guidance, and crew accommodation, incorporated into a vehicle that is, in many ways, a direct evolution of the Apollo command module, but with technology that is unrecognizably more capable. The flight computers have more processing power than all of the computers in mission control during Apollo combined. The navigation system draws on GPS satellites, star trackers, and inertial measurement units to maintain position knowledge with a precision that would have been impossible in the 1960s. The life support system is more reliable, more efficient, and better understood than anything that flew during Apollo. The astronauts who have trained for Artemis missions represent a generation of highly capable professionals who have been preparing, in some cases for more than a decade, for the possibility of flying to the moon. They have trained in underwater facilities, in centrifuges, in spacecraft simulators, in geological field training sites that serve as analogues for the lunar surface. They have studied the engineering of the vehicles they will fly, the procedures for every phase of the mission, the contingency responses for failure modes that span the full range of things that might go wrong. This investment in hardware, in people, in knowledge, is what makes the difference between a program that is ready to go when the hardware is ready and one that would need years of additional preparation even after the vehicles are available. The Artemis program is the former. The human capital has been built, the institutional knowledge exists, the readiness is real. What remains is for the hardware to validate the confidence that the program has in it. When Starship version 3 flies in May 2026, it will be carrying the accumulated knowledge of everything that every previous Starship flight taught the engineers at SpaceX. Every anomaly analyzed, every failure diagnosed, every improvement implemented, all of it will be embodied in that vehicle. The test will answer questions that simulations and analysis cannot fully resolve. When Blue Moon Mark 1 attempts a cargo landing on the moon in the same month, it will be carrying the accumulated expertise of Blue Origin's engineering teams, drawing on the company's deep knowledge of liquid hydrogen propulsion, on the orbital mechanics calculations that govern lunar descent trajectories, and on the navigation and guidance algorithms that will steer the vehicle from orbit to touchdown in a region no American spacecraft has visited since the Apollo era. Both of these flights will be watched by people across the aerospace industry with the kind of focused attention that significant test flights always attract, not just the engineers at SpaceX and Blue Origin, but their competitors, their customers, the analysts and journalists who cover the industry, the NASA officials who will be evaluating the results, and the broader public that has followed the development of commercial space with growing interest. The results will shape everything that follows. Success builds confidence and opens doors. Partial success, a landing that mostly works but identifies specific problems, provides actionable data, and maintains the timeline while defining what needs to be fixed. Outright failure, if it occurs, will require diagnosis, redesign, and additional time, and will sharpen the competition between the two companies in ways that could ultimately produce better outcomes, even as it delays the near-term schedule. Whatever happens, the program will continue. The destination is real, the imperative is clear, and the tools, for the first time, are adequate to the task. The last astronaut to walk on the moon was Harrison Schmitt, a geologist who stepped off the lunar surface on December 14, 1972, ending the final Apollo moonwalk and leaving behind a set of footprints that have been slowly eroding, grain by grain, under the constant bombardment of micrometeorites and cosmic radiation that substitutes, in the absence of wind and rain, for the weathering processes that erase footprints on Earth. Those footprints are still there. The American flags planted by the Apollo missions are still there, though their dyes have almost certainly been bleached white by decades of unfiltered ultraviolet radiation. The descent stages of the lunar modules are still there, motionless on the surface, exactly where they were left. The moon has been waiting. The next footprints will be made in a different part of the moon at the South Pole, in a region of permanently lit terrain, surrounded by some of the coldest and most ancient shadows in the solar system. They will be made by people using suits and tools and spacecraft that were not imaginable in 1972. But they will be human footprints in lunar dust on a world that no other species in the history of Earth has ever reached. That is what all of this is building toward, and it is close enough now to feel real. Stay with this story, because when it reaches the moment it is building toward, it will be worth having followed every step of the way.